The rain had been falling for hours when Daniel's car broke down on that empty stretch of road. The sky was a deep black, torn open now, and then by the pale flash of lightning that illuminated the endless line of trees on either side. His phone showed no signal, the battery icon flashing like a dying heartbeat. He cursed under his breath, stepping out into the cold night air, pulling his jacket tight as the wind slashed at his face. The rain soaked him instantly, cold and relentless, seeping into his bones as he stared down the deserted road. In the distance, through the sheets of rain, a faint glow shimmered like a mirage. He squinted, wiping the water from his eyes, and saw what looked like a building, maybe a motel, its neon sign flickering weakly like it had been forgotten by time. With no other option, Daniel grabbed his bag and trudged toward it, the mud sucking at his shoes with every step, the storm howling around him like a living thing. The sign above the door read Hillcrest Motel, the letters cracked and worn, half of them dark, the others buzzing faintly as if struggling to stay alive. He pushed open the glass door, and a small bell jingled overhead, the sound oddly sharp against the muffled roar of the storm. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying the scent of damp wood and something else, something metallic and sour that lingered beneath. The lobby was dimly lit by a single lamp on the reception desk, casting long, jagged shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The desk itself was old, its surface scarred and stained with rings of water long dried. On top of it sat an old-fashioned brass bell, dull and cold to the touch. Daniel rang it once, the sound echoing unnaturally long down the silent hallway beyond. For a moment, nothing happened, and then a woman appeared from the back room. She moved slowly, like her limbs resisted her, and when she finally reached the desk, Daniel felt a chill run through him. Her face was pale and stretched too tightly over her bones, her skin almost translucent under the weak light, and her eyes, they were dark, but not the soft kind of dark you'd expect from brown eyes. These were bottomless pits that seemed to drink in the light around them. Her lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach those eyes, and her voice when she spoke was soft, hollow, like a whisper carried on a breath that didn't belong to her. "Welcome," she said, her tone both inviting and empty. "Traveling alone?" Daniel nodded, clearing his throat, trying to shake off the unease slithering through his gut. She didn't ask for his ID, didn't check a register. Instead, she bent slowly, her movements deliberate, and when she straightened, she held an old brass key in her bony hand, the number 6 engraved deep into its surface. "Room 6, she said, her voice dropping an octave as her eyes locked on his. "Stay inside after midnight." The way she said it wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Daniel managed a weak laugh, muttered a thank you, and turned toward the hallway, clutching the key so tightly it dug into his palm. The corridor stretched out like a tunnel, its carpet damp beneath his shoes, squelching softly with every step. The walls were lined with faded paintings, their subjects warped and indistinct, as if they had been smeared by time. The wallpaper peeled away in curling strips, revealing wood that looked dark and rotten beneath. Each door he passed had a tarnished brass number, but they all seemed wrong somehow, like the numbers had been rearranged or scratched at, leaving faint scars in the wood. Room 6 was at the very end, its door darker than the others, its surface rough and splintered as if something had clawed at it. Daniel hesitated, the weight of the silence pressing down on him, before he slid the key into the lock. The door creaked open, the sound sharp and loud, like a scream swallowed by the dark. The room smelled of mildew and damp cloth, and the single lamp on the nightstand cast a weak, yellow glow that barely pushed back the shadows clinging to the corners. The bed looked old but freshly made, though the blanket felt oddly damp when his fingers brushed over it. An old rotary phone sat on the nightstand, its cord coiled like a nest of snakes, and above it hung a mirror, far too large for such a small room, its surface warped just slightly as if it remembered every reflection it had ever held. Daniel dropped his bag and sank onto the edge of the bed, running his hands through his wet hair, his thoughts a tangle of exhaustion and unease. The storm outside roared, lightning flaring behind the thin curtains like the sky itself was being torn apart. It was only then that he noticed something etched into the wooden frame of the mirror, small letters carved deep and jagged. "Look at her." He frowned, leaning closer, tracing the letters with his fingertip. They felt old, like they had been scratched there in desperation. A chill crawled up his spine as he sat back down, laughing nervously to himself, whispering that it was just some sick joke left by a previous guest. He lay back, staring at the stained ceiling, counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the old building made him flinch. Every moan of the wind sounded like a whisper brushing against the walls. Time dragged, heavy and slow, until at last the clock on the nightstand clicked over to 12 o'clock a.m. The exact moment it did, the phone on the nightstand rang. The shrill sound ripped through the silence like a blade, and Daniel jolted upright, his heart slamming against his ribs. He stared at the phone, his breath shallow, his fingers trembling as he reached for it. He lifted the receiver to his ear, and for a moment there was nothing but silence, thick and suffocating. Then, a voice. A woman's voice, soft and broken, like it came from deep underground. "Don't turn around." The words crawled into his ear like icy fingers, and every hair on his body stood on end. Daniel froze, his muscles locking, his breath catching in his throat. He tried to speak, but his voice died in his mouth. The line went dead, the silence on the other end colder than the storm outside. Slowly he lowered the receiver, his hands shaking so hard he almost dropped it. That was when he saw the mirror, the reflection. It wasn't right. In the glass he could see the bed, the lamp, the door behind him. But the door was open in the reflection, wide open. His blood turned to ice as he turned his head just enough to see that the door was still closed. When he looked back at the mirror, the reflection had changed again. There was someone standing in the doorway. A woman. Her skin was gray, sagging in places as if it had melted, and her hair hung in long, wet strands, dripping water onto the floor. Her head was tilted forward, hiding her face behind that curtain of black hair, and her arms hung limp at her sides, her fingers grazing the carpet like claws. Daniel's heart hammered as he stared, unable to move, unable to breathe. In the reflection, she began to move toward him. One step, two. Her bare feet left wet, dark stains on the floor as she came closer and closer until she stood right behind him in the glass. Daniel's entire body screamed to move, to run, but he couldn't. He couldn't even blink. Then the lamp flickered, just once, and when it came back, the mirror was empty. The reflection showed only him, pale and trembling, his eyes wide with terror. He let out a shaky laugh, telling himself it wasn't real, just his imagination twisted by fear and exhaustion. He stood, grabbing his bag, deciding to leave, storm or no storm. But when he reached the door and turned the handle, it wouldn't move. He yanked harder, putting all his weight into it, but the door stayed locked, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Then he heard it, breathing. Slow, heavy breathing right behind him. He turned and she was there. Not in the mirror this time. In the room. Standing in the corner, her head still bowed, her hair dripping black water onto the carpet. The smell hit him then. A stench of rot and stagnant water that clawed at his throat. She began to move, not walking but gliding, her feet barely lifting, her body jerking with unnatural spasms as she came closer. Daniel stumbled back, his spine pressing against the unyielding door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Slowly, her head began to rise, and as her face came into view, Daniel wished he had never asked. Her eyes were empty holes, black and endless, swallowing the dim light whole, and her mouth stretched into a grin so wide it split her cheeks, revealing teeth that were long and broken and wrong. She let out a sound then, not a scream, not a moan, but something worse, something that sounded like bones grinding together, mixed with 1,000 whispers echoing from the dark. Daniel slid to the floor, his body shaking violently as she loomed over him, her grin stretching further, her jaw cracking with the sound of splintering bone. Her icy fingers curled around his face, her nails biting into his skin as she lowered her head to his ear. "You should have stayed in bed," she whispered, her voice like the wind through a grave. The last thing Daniel felt was her nails piercing his flesh, the world going black as the storm outside swallowed the night. And in room 6 of the Hillcrest Motel, the bed remained empty, the mirror shattered into jagged smiles, and the old rotary phone began to ring again, soft and patient, waiting for the next guest who would never leave. The old rotary phone kept ringing long after Daniel's body had gone cold, each shrill note cutting through the silence like a blade, but there was no one left to answer it, only the dark walls of room 6 watching, breathing, listening. The storm outside raged like it was trying to warn the world of what had just happened inside that room, but no one would hear it. No one ever did. Hours passed, the rain slowing to a gentle tap against the windows, the thunder rolling away into the distance, and the motel sank back into its endless, suffocating silence. Then the front door creaked open. Another traveler stepped inside, dripping rain onto the warped wooden floor. Her name was Emily, and she was young, barely 22, her eyes tired from a long drive that stretched into night. She had been on her way to visit her sick mother in a town far from here when her car ran out of gas on that lonely stretch of road. And like Daniel before her, she had seen the faint glow in the distance, the flicker of a neon sign like a dying star calling her closer. She walked to the reception desk, her shoes squelching softly, and rang the bell, its echo crawling through the empty halls. The same woman appeared from the shadows of the back room, her movements slow, her face pale and hollow, those dark eyes glistening like oil under the weak light. She smiled that same smile, the one that stretched but never reached her eyes, and in her thin hands, the brass key waited like it had been expecting Emily all along. "Room 6, the woman said, her voice soft and heavy with something that wasn't quite human. Emily hesitated, her fingers brushing over the cold metal of the key as she took it, her heart skipping a beat when the woman added, "Stay inside after midnight." She didn't ask why. She didn't want to. There was something in the woman's tone, something that made the question rot in her throat before it could leave her lips. She walked down the hall, the floor creaking under her feet, the damp carpet clutching at her shoes. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing down on her chest like a weight, and when she reached room 6, the door loomed before her, dark and scarred as though it had been beaten by time itself. She unlocked it and stepped inside, her breath hitching as the smell hit her, a stench of damp and decay that clung to the air like a living thing. The room was almost identical to how Daniel had seen it. The peeling wallpaper, the weak glow of the lamp, the mirror hanging above the nightstand like an unblinking eye. But Emily didn't notice the faint stains on the carpet near the corner, dark and irregular, or the shards of glass wedged deep into the cracks of the floor where the mirror had once broken and somehow healed again. She dropped her bag on the bed, sat down, and let out a shaky breath, telling herself it was just a room, just a place to sleep for a few hours until morning came. But the clock on the nightstand ticked louder than it should have, each second dragging like nails across her nerves, and the storm outside began to fade until the silence in the room felt louder than thunder. Emily tried to distract herself, scrolling through her phone, but there was no signal, no connection to anything beyond these walls. Her battery was almost dead, the screen dimming like an eye slowly closing, and when it finally went black, she felt more alone than ever. Midnight crept closer, the clock ticking like a heartbeat, and as the last minute of 11 faded away, Emily thought about what the woman had said. Stay inside after midnight. Why? Her stomach twisted as she stared at the door, the brass handle gleaming faintly in the dim light. That was when the phone rang. She jumped, her heart slamming against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat as the shrill sound tore through the silence. Slowly, she reached for the receiver, her fingers trembling, and lifted it to her ear. For a moment, there was nothing but static, a soft crackle like dry leaves underfoot. Then a voice, faint and broken, a whisper so soft it seemed to come from inside her head. "Don't look in the mirror. Emily froze, her eyes flicking to the glass hanging above the nightstand. Her own reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed, and for a second she thought she saw something move in the background, something small and fast like a shadow crawling across the wall. Her breath quickened, her fingers tightening on the phone, but the line went dead with a soft click, leaving her alone with the echo of those words. "Don't look in the mirror." She swallowed hard, forcing a laugh, telling herself it was a prank, just some weirdo messing with guests. But the laughter died in her throat when the lamp flickered, once, twice, then held steady. She stared at the mirror, her pulse pounding, and in the glass she saw herself, sitting on the bed, clutching the phone. Only there was something else. Behind her reflection near the door stood a figure, a woman. Her head tilted forward, her hair hanging in wet black ropes, dripping onto the carpet. Emily spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but the door was closed, the room empty. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone, but the carpet near the door was wet now, dark stains spreading like ink. Emily's breath came in sharp bursts, her body trembling as she stood and backed away from the mirror, every instinct screaming at her to leave. She grabbed her bag, ran to the door and twisted the handle, but it didn't budge. She yanked harder, pounding on the wood, shouting for help, but the only answer was silence. Then the lamp flickered again. This time it didn't come back on. The room plunged into darkness, thick and absolute, and Emily felt the air change, growing cold and damp, brushing against her skin like clammy fingers. She heard it then, the sound of water dripping, slow and steady, and beneath it something else. Breathing. A low, rattling breath, coming from the corner where the shadows were deepest. Emily's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, the screen glowing faintly as it came to life. But the light barely reached the edges of the bed before it flickered and died for good. She was blind now, blind and alone, except for the sound of that breathing growing louder, closer, until she could feel it against her face like a foul wind from a grave. She stumbled back, her body colliding with the nightstand, the phone falling from her grip and shattering on the floor. Then she felt it, a hand, cold and wet, curling around her wrist, the grip like iron. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the dark as something yanked her forward, slamming her into the wall. Her head spun, stars bursting behind her eyes, and when her vision cleared, she saw her. The woman, the one from the mirror. Her face was inches away, and Emily wished she had never seen it. Her skin was gray and bloated, her lips split and black, and her eyes were holes, gaping voids that seemed to pull her in, swallowing her whole. The grin stretched across her face, splitting her cheeks until black water dripped from the cracks, and when she spoke, her voice crawled through Emily's skull like maggots. "You shouldn't have looked." Emily tried to scream again, but the woman's hand clamped over her mouth, icy and unyielding, and the last thing she saw before the dark took her was that grin, stretching wider and wider until it split her face in two. The next morning the storm had passed, the sun rising weak and pale over the empty road. A car sat outside the Hillcrest Motel, its door open, its seats damp with rain. Inside the lobby, the old woman sat behind the desk, her dark eyes fixed on nothing, her thin fingers tapping against the brass bell in a slow, steady rhythm. And in room 6, the mirror was whole again, its glass clean and gleaming, reflecting an empty bed and a nightstand with a phone that would soon ring again, waiting for the next voice to answer, the next soul to take. Because no one ever leaves room 6, they only stay forever.